My name is Octavio Heredia, and thank you for having us. Today, I will make an overview of the National Survey of Household Income and Expenditure. We call it ENIGH, and for the Spanish acronym. So this survey is collected by INEGI every 2 years and is one of the most important in Mexico. Therefore, this forum represents an extraordinary opportunity to tell about the ENIGH's 2022 findings, which were published in July 26 of this year. However, before to present the results, I will first take about the background and the methodological characteristics of this survey. So let's get started. In Mexico, the antecedents of this kind of survey is identified since 1914, when the Mexican government applied different questionnaires to know the main expense of working class family. The first survey with the sampling method was collected in 1956, and between 1916 and 1975, another surveys were collected with different methodological characteristics. Imagine, I think in those years, the methodology homologation was some difficult, was impossible. But in 1977, the Mexican government designed the first precedent of the survey model that INEGI took up in 1984. So that in that year, INEGI conducted the first ENIGH, and since 1992, the survey is conducted every 2 years. Let me tell you that since INEGI assumed responsibility of the survey, it has worked to reformulate the objectives and standardize the methodology based on international recommendations and taking in consideration requirements of different users. An important fact is that in September 2012, the ENIGH was determined as information of national interest, recognizing the importance of the information for the monitoring of politics publics, for having a robust methodology, and having periodic surveys. All right. What are the goals of the survey? The ENIGH measures the amount, origin, and distribution of the household income and expenditure. At the same time, the survey studied the characteristics and service of the homes, the composition of the household, characteristics, sociodemographics of the population. For example, in homes, we measure basic service, such availability of water, drainage, electricity, and in people we make some measures about educational level, access to health, employment, economic activity, co-resident, etc. Initially, ENIGH was focused to provide information about the spending patterns for the price index. But now, the data collected by the survey had many other use in the last few years, such as studies of socioeconomic levels of the population, monitoring of SDGs indicators, market studies, and poverty measurement. And what is the design of this survey? Okay, the survey focus its study on household within the limits of the country. The observation unit are the dwellings, the household, and their usual residents. The design provides information for the following levels. National, first national, each of the 32 states at the state level for urban and rural domains. Regarding the sample design, it's probabilistic, so the results can be generalized to all households. And the sample selection is done in 2 stages. In the first stage, we select conglomerates, and in the second stage, we select dwellings with methods, randomly methods. The sample size is 1,000 dwellings, 105,000 dwellings, and it's the largest in the history of the survey, this since 2020. The survey is collected between August 21 and November 28. Always is the same date. The survey applies the same staff training strategy. Okay. Let me tell about the conceptual design. We are focused to the total income, and it's made up of the total current income and the total current income, financial assets, and capital. We will focus on the total current income for household, who is the income regular and available in the household for purchase, goods, and service. If the income modify the net wealth or the net value, assets and debts, we don't take it. No? Even so, the survey collects data for both kind of income. And some similar situation we have in the case of the expenditure. Okay, what do we capture in the current income? On the slide, on this slide and the other 3, I will present a list of variables of monetary income, non-monetary income, and monetary expenditure. In this case, we have information about current monetary income, and we have three sectors. 1 is income from work, 2 is revenue of property, 3 is transfers, and in the right side, we have the variables of this kind of topics. Remunerations for subordinate work, by the way, it's the highest income. Then wage, salaries, cash bonus, and overtime wage, income in the self-employed, family enterprise, and the self-employed, other work income, other jobs, difference to the primary and secondary occupation, income from assets, interests and dividends for investment in enterprise in which the investor does not work, income for transfer. In particular, we can talk a little more about monetary income from transfer. We have these variables, retirements and pensions, scholarship for government and institutions, donations of money from institution or another household, income from another countries, and benefits for government programs. In last one, we have all the social programs like Becas Benito Juárez, Jóvenes Construyendo Futuro, all the programs, social programs in Mexico. Okay, now regarding current non-monetary income, we basically have 4 sources. The first is self-consumption. That is an estimate of the value of the products and services taken from the family enterprises for household consumption. Imagine a family who take a product of his grocery. The second one is in-kind remuneration. That is an estimate of the value of the products and service that the worker receives of the payment of the work. Think about a supplement of your salary with coupons, with food or another products, etc. The third is transfers, in-kind transfers. This is an estimate of the value of the transfers in goods and services received by a household, whether from other household, a government, or a private institution. You can think about gifts on food, clothing, payments for service, etc. And the last one is estimate rental value of your own home. This is a perception variable. We measure an estimate of the cost of rent if a home did not belong to the household. This point only applies to owned homes. Imagine the person interviewed make an estimate of the cost according to the present market value. By example, how much could you rent your house for? Is the kind of question that we use in the survey. All right. By composition, the current monetary expenditure of the household is grouped into 9 items. We have food and beverages, tobacco. This is the most important category. The second one is clothing and footwear, housing and conservation service, electric powers and fuels, items and service for cleaning and care of the house, glassware, whites and household utensils, household goods and furniture. We have health expenditure, transportation expenditure, acquisitions, maintenance, accessories, vehicle service and communications. We have expenditures on education, leisure items and service, tour and peri package, lodging and accommodation. 8, personal cares, accessories, personal effects, and another miscellaneous expenditure. And the last one is expenditures for transfer, for other transfer. In this kind of classifications, we have more of 500 expenditures categories. Okay, once I mentioned what the conceptual design contains, I present the 6 questionnaires that collect in the home. The first is questionnaire of household and housing. The second one is questionnaire for people aged 12 and over. Third is the questionnaire for home business. Then questionnaire for people under 12 years old. Then other 2 questionnaires of expenditures. The first is household expenses questionnaire. And finally, the bucket of daily expenses. This last questionnaire is left at home every day, so that the previous days expenses can be recorded, and every day we check that the information in this questionnaire is correct. The interviewer visits the home 7 consecutive days to collect the questionnaires. And we have more than 300 questions throughout the questionnaires. So far, I conclude with the main methodological characteristics, and then I will present some results. I will start with the household income. Okay. Let us remember that current income is divided in 5 sectors. What is the principal? In Mexico, the primary source is income from work with 65.7%, followed by transfer with 70.2%, the estimate of the rental of housing with 11.8%, and the revenue of property with 5.2%. The next is little or so small, very small. And a further breakdown of this is presented in the next slide. And I'm going to say a little message of this table. The first is that in 2022, the average quarterly current income per household was $3,165. And it's equivalent to a daily income of $16 per income recipient. Imagine that. What's the minimum wage in California? I don't know, but I think it's 10, 11 times bigger. I don't know. The average current income were skyrocketed by respect 2020 by 11%. The income from work grew 14.3%. But you can start observing the pandemic period. As a result of the pandemic, average current income between 2018 and 2020 plummeted by 5.8%, motivated by the 10.7% drop in income from work. Note that in 2020, transfer income grew 8.3% compared to 2018. And again, in 2020, transfer income grew 8% compared to 2020. If we do a gridded breakdown of the income, we can see that income from remuneration of subordinate work was $1,752, while in 2020 it was $1,537. That is $215 less. The next most important source of income in transfer, whose average quarterly current income was $543. In transfer, the highest income of the is from retirements and pensions with $257 on average. And you can see that the transfers from government programs were $88. That is 2.8% of the average quarterly current income. In the next slide, we will see the difference between one year and another. By example, you can see that the average current income from remunerations for subordinate job between 2018 and 2020 plummeted by 10.7%, and in 2020 it grew 14%. It can be that all components of labor income and revenue of the property fell in 2020. Between 2020 and 2022, the specific incomes with growth above 25% were income from self-employment, income from other countries, and benefits of government program. All right. In this slide, we saw the average current income. Let me see. Okay. Okay. We saw the average current income grew between 2020 and 2022, but how does the growth behave according to the income distribution? Okay. In this slide, we present information by decile. So in 2022, household in the first decile had average income of $666, approximately $3.3 per day per recipient. It represents a growth of 18.3% compared to 2020. For household in the 10th decile, income was $9,973. It involves $49 per day per recipient. The 10th decile has an income of 15 times greater than the first decile, and the 10th decile concentrates 31.5% of the total current income. It can be seen that in 2020, the lower deciles had smaller reductions in income compared to the upper. In 2022, the lower deciles had greater percent growth in income compared to the higher deciles. Okay, another way to analyze the issues of the income inequality is through the Gini coefficient. The value of this coefficient for income by deciles of household is 0.402 in 2022. And furthermore, the Gini coefficient will enable us to appreciate the positive effects of transfer on income distribution. If in 2022 there were no transfer in income, the concentration of this would have been higher. Okay. And what about with the different states of Mexico? Do you know that Mexico is a country with many realities? No. So in this map, you can see light colors represent low income, while dark colors represent high incomes. We can see that the northern border states tend to have higher incomes compared to the southern states. By example, the three states with the highest income in Mexico are Baja California Sur with $4,543, Ciudad de Mexico with $4,438, and Baja California with $4,418. And the three states with the lowest income were Chiapas, Guerrero, and Oaxaca. Okay. Okay, in the last slides, we were able to observe the income results and the household level. Now I will analyze different statistics at the person level. For example, in 2022, the quarterly average income by person was $1,213. However, there is an important difference between men and women. We have a gender gap of 34.8% of women's income compared to men's. Okay, and we have other difference depends of the age of groups. Another way to see this topic is comparing the average income between men and women by the number of children. Note that the smaller gender gap occurs when men and women do not have children at 21%, but the average income of women decreases as the number of children increase. When a woman has 4 or more children, her average income is $675 and represents a gender gap of 57% compared to the average income of men. Regarding the average monetary income by level of education, we can see that it increases as the level of education increases. People with an elementary school level have an average income of $675, while people with a master's degree or higher have an average income of $4,471. The gender gap is once again drawing attention, even the highest levels of the education. In the case of the indigenous people, important difference in income levels are also observed. Remember that a person is indigenous if he identifies as such, or if he speaks an indigenous language. Note that the average income of indigenous language speakers was $681, while not indigenous people had an average of 1,399. Gender gaps persist again. Another interesting group is people with disabilities. A person with disabilities is one who has great difficulties or cannot carry out their daily activities. People with disabilities had an average income of $824, while people without disabilities have an average income of $1,248. The average income can be observed depending of the type of the disability among the specific types. The lowest income, 553, occurs in people with difficulties speaking and communicating. Okay. Until now, every was in terms of income, but what about expenditures? Now we will see the distribution of household expenditure is. Okay, for 2022, the average current income monetary expenditure was $1,986. Between 2020 and 2022, there was a growth of 70.2%. Remember that the quarterly average current monetary expenditure is divided into 9 sectors which are presented in this table, ordered by the percent variation between 2020 and 2022. We can see the expenditure of clothing and footwear and the expenditure on education and recreation skyrocketed by 15%. The following growth was on transportation with 22%, and food, beverages, and tobacco with 16%. Other transfer with 9.2%, and home cleaning with 8.9%. The case of expenditure of housing and service was similar. And finally, the health expenditure dropped of 7%. However, this comparison must be made by observing the behavior of these expenditures between 2018 and 2020, again, a consequence of the pandemic. For example, between 2018 and 2020, the expenditure dropped 12.9%. The population significantly decreased its spending on education, clothing and footwear, and transportation. By contrast, during the pandemic period, health expenditure growth peaked at 14%. Note that in general, all the expenditure sectors recovered in 2022. In the case of health expenditures, also they decreased by 2022, but they did not return to 2016 or 2018 levels. On this slide, we focus on the average monetary expenditure of food, beverages, and tobacco. This category represents the largest household expenditure with 38%, and it can be broken down in what is consumed inside the home, what is consumed outside the home, and as well tobacco. For consumption within the home, it's possible to make a breakdown of the average expenditure of specific products. By example, the highest expense per quarter is found in those consumed within the home with $598, which represents the 80% of the sector. Inside, mid expenditure is the highest, reach an average of 139 per quarter, and it growth by 9.5% between 2020 and 2022. By example, the average expenditure on milk and its derivatives dropped by 5.4% in 2018 and 4.4% in 2022. In 2022, it grew by 5%. The average expenditure on eggs grew by 5%, 11%, and 21% in the years of 2018, 2020, and 2022, respectively. Okay. Now, what's the average currently spending per house based on the household income level? We can see this through income deciles. The average quarterly expenditure per household in the first decile was 732, while the average expenditure in the 10th decile was 5,018. Between 2020 and 2022, the deciles had a recovery. Even in the 10th decile, present the highest growth of 21.8%. However, in the balance from 2018 and 2022, the lower part of the distribution shows growth of more than 9%, and the upper part of the distribution does not reach the levels of 2018. This allows us to observe a certain coherence between the behavior of the income and the expenses, both strengthened at the bottom of the distribution. With this, I conclude my presentation, but not before mentioning that all the ENIGH information is found in the INEGI website. We have presentations, we have technical notes, methodological documents, statistical tables, database, codes to replicate some variables in every project, by example. And I invite you to consult them. Thank you very much.
Continúa Francisco Garfias. Next is Francisco Garfias, UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy.
Thank you.
Are you going to stay in the podium, or you want a hand mic?
I'm just going to change the slide deck.
Okay.
Probably, most of the time, yeah. Thank you. Okay. Okay, I think I'll just present on the browser idea. Great, thank you. I am Francisco Garfias. I'm a professor of political science here at the School of Global Policy and Strategy. And this is going to be more of a reaction to this very detailed overview that Octavio gave us of the ENIGH. And what I'll try to do is basically highlight three things that I want to stress. The first one has to do with the importance of the ENIGH as a tool for measuring and assessing the state of the Mexican population's economic welfare. I also want to highlight the ENIGH as a really important input for academic research. And I want to stress the importance that ENIGH is establishing a microdata lab here at UCSD and how that might be really helpful for the research community in the area, right? By providing really detailed access to information that may not be available through the excellent website that the INEGI runs. Okay, and so with some apologies for the way this needs to be displayed, I'll just begin with the first point, that just following up on some of the things that Octavio already mentioned. So ENIGH, as Octavio highlighted, is one of the main instruments that INEGI has to take snapshots at the Mexican population's economic decisions. It's a key source of information on income and expenditure. This was briefly mentioned, but I want to stress that ENIGH has a long series that is semi-comparable. Some of the results that Octavio showed start in 2016 for a good reason, because the survey is comparable for that period, though you can make some adjustments to make some of the results in the surveys comparable for a longer period of time. And so this is a really useful feature of the survey, because it not only allows us to take a sort of a photograph look at the Mexican population at a given point in time, but also to compare changes. The survey is also representative at the state level for all states since 2016 and for some selected states before that. And that is also really helpful because it allows us to zoom in to particular regions of interest and say something representative about the Mexican population there. And so overall, taking all of these features of the design of the survey together, this makes the ENIGH an ideal tool to diagnose population needs, to evaluate policy interventions, and to identify policy gaps where it might be a good idea to intervene. Okay, so I'll take one example that I find to be especially prominent. This is just going to be an illustration rather than a thorough description like the one Octavio provided. And this is the official poverty measure in Mexico. And ENIGH plays really a central role in the definition of the line and its measurement. So generally speaking, in very general terms, the way this line is computed is in these two steps. First, there's in the background a conceptual design that is meant to really make hard choices about how we conceptualize poverty, right? Once that decision is made, in particular when measuring poverty via income, the line needs to be defined. That's usually done by constructing consumption baskets, right? So ordinarily, a basket is defined by minimum caloric intake that you need to have in order to be healthy. And that is constructed using the ENIGH, right? So in this first crucial step, the ENIGH plays a central role. In the second step, which is what most of us are really interested in, is just finding out how many people fall below some predefined poverty line, the ENIGH also plays a central role, right? We use all of these detailed measurements of income in particular that Octavio was describing in order to put different people into a bin of below the poverty line or not. Okay, and so just to highlight a couple of high-level results of the latest measurement done by Coneval using the ENIGH, we can actually know that 12.1% of the Mexican population falls below their extreme poverty line, right? So this is the most sort of extreme measure of poverty by income that ENIGH has defined. And when you look at a different line, that population grows to 43.5%. So we can get this snapshot at the national level of how many poor people are in Mexico according to this line. Now, because ENIGH is representative at the state level, we can actually get a closer look at how poverty is manifested across the country, right? And so we have high poverty states like Chiapas, Guerrero, Oaxaca, where up to 28% in Chiapas of the population fall below the extreme poverty line. And then you have states like Baja California Sur, Nuevo León, Colima, with much lower levels of extreme poverty. Now, much attention in this presentation and in Octavio's presentation was paid to income and expenditure, but ENIGH also has modules that measure other interesting things about the population. And in particular, there are things that have to do with education, with access to services, with access to social and government programs, health and nutrition. And so these different features that ENIGH measures also allows us, and Coneval in this case, to construct what's now called the multidimensional poverty lines that is based not only on income, but on these other characteristics. And so, you know, I won't describe the figure, but it's basically reflecting all the wealth of information that this survey contains. Now, beyond what's an official poverty line, these are things that the Mexican government itself is doing by using the ENIGH. There is a ton of work by academics, policy experts, and NGOs that use the ENIGH as a way to inform and recommend public policy. And so, just to give you an example from some work I did a long time ago in 2000, using the ENIGH of 2008, you can use this very rich information in the survey to inform interesting policy debates. In particular, we were trying to inform this debate that existed at the time and that we still have about the relative benefits and drawbacks of targeted versus universal social programs that, you know, have different advantages and different costs. And, you know, a key thing that we need to understand in order to compare these benefits and costs is whether, for example, universal programs actually reach all of the intended population or not. And the counterpoint to that is whether targeted programs are actually reaching the intended population that they're trying to target, right? The analysis using sources like ENIGH also makes it feasible to at least speculate about what would happen if a certain policy that is implemented in a focalized way is scaled up, right? We can start thinking in structured ways about these really important questions that are generally hard to answer. And so the example that you know, the project that I worked on using the ENIGH had to do with the incidence of the 70 más program, this you know, on paper universal benefit. It's an amount of money that it's transferred to people above a certain age threshold. And back then in 2008, this program was only available to people living in certain places, in particular rural areas with small populations. Since then, it has expanded to be what truly looks like a universal program. And so here you can see very much in the spirit of some of the descriptives that Octavio presented earlier, we can see how people that fall on different decile beams, from poorest people to the wealthier people according to ENIGH, fall on the incidence of these programs, right? And so we have programs like Oportunidades, for example, which is well known as a progressive program in terms of the incidence, that predictably is not received by the very wealthy households, but has a higher incidence among the poorest households. Similarly, the 70 más program, as well as the counterpart in Mexico City, despite being universal in a certain geographic jurisdiction, had back then this progressive composition of its incidence. Okay, but those are just examples. I'm not trying to be comprehensive. All I want to highlight is that a survey like ENIGH is a major policy input for policy evaluation and design, both from the official side, the studies that the government runs, as well as from the academic side. And so with that, I want to turn to my second big point, which has to do with the ENIGH as a source of data for social science academic research, which makes this connection with UCSD, I think, a really valuable one for the community here. So what I have here, again, in the spirit of just presenting some interesting examples, is a decidedly non-random selection of papers from top economics publications in recent years that use the ENIGH, right, as an important part of the argument they're trying to make. And so as you can see, just this snapshot, this was a quick search. I didn't have to spend much time on it. This is something that academic researchers are, ordinarily using when they're interested in questions that have to do with the things that the ENIGH captures, like income and expenditure. And so just to give you two examples that are going to be slightly different from what you've heard so far in this panel. We have this paper by Jones and Kleno from 2016, in which they propose a welfare measure that's sort of an alternative to GDP, which is, as you may know, the most commonly used measure of welfare that we have to compare countries to one another. And so they try to incorporate things that are not directly measured by GDP, like consumption, leisure, rates of mortality, and inequality measured in different ways. Now, how could they actually do this in the absence of rich sources of information like ENIGH? It's not possible to do that in a high quality way. And so they take this collection of 13 countries that have these types of high quality instruments, and that includes Mexico, right? They come up with their measure, and this figure that I have here just is a representation of their welfare measure. And so you can see as they try to highlight that it correlates positively with GDP. So higher levels of GDP also create a higher measure of this welfare that they propose. But there are important gaps. And so countries that are relatively poor in terms of GDP on average also are, they exhibit lower levels of welfare according to this multidimensional measure, whereas countries that have higher levels of GDP, in some ways the GDP is underplaying how wealthy they are as it comes to these other measures. All right, again, only possible with sources like the ENIGH. A second example has to do with just interesting causal questions that are relevant for both academic research and in this case also with policy implications. So this paper by Atkin, Faber, and Gonzalez Navarro, they try to examine what is the impact of foreign chain stores coming into a particular area. What happens to the welfare of the people that is impacted by this new store? And what they find is that the entry of these stores increases welfare, but it does so in a regressive way. So it benefits the wealthier people more than it does the poorer people. And they do a really exhaustive empirical set of tests to characterize these changes in welfare, finding that what's driving this increase in welfare is a reduction in the price of things that people buy, which in turn reduces the cost of living. And so the ENIGH is one of a host of sources that they use to do this analysis. It's not the only one, but it's a key part of their welfare effects quantification. So they need to have a measure of what's the share, for example, of income that people use to spend in a department store, and that comes from ENIGH in this particular case. And so key sources of data to come at these really important and interesting conclusions. Okay, so my final stop here is just to highlight my excitement for the establishment of this microdata lab here at UCSD. Now, Octavio emphasized, and I want to stress again, that most of the information that you see here, in fact, all of the data that Octavio showed you is something that you yourself can reproduce using the sources that ENIGH publishes. So you can download the microdata that's available from ENIGH's website and produce similar results. There are pieces of this data, however, that are not publicly available, and for a good reason, right? So you don't want to be able to identify the individual respondents that are providing a ton of information about their lives, right? Just in the expenditure questionnaire that Octavio presented, 300 questions. Like, it's a really detailed snapshot at what your life looks like, and you're only willing to answer those questions if you are pretty sure that your identity is going to be protected by ENIGH. And I think by ENIGH, sorry. And I think ENIGH has done a really excellent job at creating this reputation of an institution that really takes seriously these confidentiality rights. And so in order to balance the interest of privacy as well as the interest of researchers and research and public policy oriented research, venues like the Microdata Lab, I think are really the way to do it. And so generally the way this works is a researcher comes with a proposal to access what is otherwise not publicly available information, INEGI makes an evaluation of that request and guarantees that maybe the research question is answerable with this data without compromising the identity of respondents, okay? And so I just want to provide one example from my own ongoing research on how this could potentially be useful to illustrate what I mean by this and maybe also inspire its use for your own research interests. And so my example is the evaluation of the effects of the Habitat program. This is an urban infrastructure program that occurred between 2009 and 2011. This was randomly implemented in an evaluation phase. It provided very valuable urban amenities in poor urban neighborhoods across the country. And the evaluation was designed and implemented by our colleague here, Craig McIntosh, with a team of PIs from COLEF. And they found in an initial evaluation that this program increased property values. It crowded in private investment. So it was very successful at increasing the welfare of the benefited communities. Now, my own interest in this is slightly different, and so I want to assess whether receiving a substantial investment by the government changes the likelihood that you pay your property taxes, right? So perhaps by observing that the government is doing a good job at investing in your community, you as a property owner are more likely to comply with this quasi-voluntary tax. And so what we've been doing so far, without using ENIGH data, is to combine the data from the Habitat evaluation with administrative sources in Mexico City, from the Treasury in Mexico City. We're able to identify properties that were benefited by Habitat, whose neighborhood was benefited by Habitat, and then doing an analysis of that experiment, we find that there's essentially no impact of Habitat on property tax compliance. So people do not respond to this program by increasing their compliance. And beyond that, we are lucky enough to be powered and to a degree that allows us to rule out even small effects. Now, a follow-up that is of, I think, policy interest. So this is good for Mexico City. Now we sort of know the answer there. But Habitat was implemented nationwide, and so we might be interested in knowing whether this is an effect that extends beyond Mexico City. And so one way to do that would be to employ, and I'm speculating here, we have not done this, hopefully with the microdata lab, we might be able to answer this question using the data from ENIGH. Okay, and so how would that work? So this is what the program looks like in Mexico City, right? So we have treated and controlled communities that are depicted there by in sort of whitish gray and black. A lot of properties, but only a handful of treated polygons. And so let me zoom in here. This is the type of spatial coverage that we have in mind with Habitat. So we have this neighborhood here that was treated, this other neighborhood here that was untreated, and the program was randomly assigned between this. And so what I have in mind with the micro data lab that INEGI might provide with ENIGH is we could potentially identify respondents that fall within these communities and try to assess using their own self-declared expenses in property taxes, which are included in the very detailed questionnaire that the ENIGH runs. And we could assess whether declared property tax payments increase in treated communities, right? This would allow us to go beyond Mexico City and examine the program's effects nationally. Okay, and so this is only possible with opportunities like the one the microdata lab might provide. This is not publicly available information because, of course, you don't want to disclose exactly where a respondent lives, right? This needs to be protected. And so with that in mind, I just want to close doing a quick recap. The ENIGH, again, it's a really important input for policy evaluation and design, both from the official side as well as from the academic research side. And I think, I just want to, again, share my real excitement for the establishment of a microdata lab, which will allow us to use not only ENIGH, but other sources that INEGI provides. Right? That's it. Thank you.
going to continue with Jennifer. Are you going to be on the podium, or you want a mic, or are you going to be on the podium? Perfect.
I know, yeah. It works, but partially. I'm sorry. Yeah,
No, it's okay.
This one doesn't work for some reason. Maybe you can make it work.
Give it another whirl.
Maybe,
Okay.
maybe.
I'll try.
Maybe that's it.
Okay. Let me invite everyone to just stand up for a minute if you need to stretch. You've been sitting for a bit. Thank you for being here. Okay. Okay.
Jóvenes, al final, por favor, no se me vayan a ir porque necesito tomar una foto de grupo en la parte frontal, ya que concluya. ¿Ok? Voy a cerrar la puerta para que no se me vayan. Gracias.
Okay. Okay, sure.
So we're going to start now. Can you please take a seat? Jennifer?
All right. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you guys for being here. I recognize that we're talking to you in this nice, warm room after lunch, and so it's very easy to be sleepy, but hopefully we will keep it entertaining. My name is Jen Burney, and I'm faculty here at UC San Diego. I study climate and food security, which may be a field that feels a little bit far removed from INEGI, but I want to talk today about how these data are so important for these fields as well, and how we link to it, and really how grateful my whole scholarly community is for the type of quality data that come from INEGI and from the ENIGH in particular, and why we're excited also about the new data lab opening here. All right. So I'll start with something that everyone in the room certainly knows and understands, and that is that Mexico is really a microcosm of the globe. And when we think about climate change and when we think about food security, there's no better place to look than Mexico to think about what the future of the world is going to look like. Why is that? A few reasons. Of course, for millennia, Mexico has been the canonical agriculture region of the world. And even though agriculture is concentrated now, as it has over time, it's still a really important national sector. Mexico is a critical global producer, has been key in reducing food security around the world over time. And of course, as a country is really navigating right now the challenge that the entire world is trying to navigate, and that is really how do we feed the world and protect our environment at the same time. So Mexico really sits in the core there. At the same time, there are remaining food insecurity challenges within the country. That's not unique, of course. One of the most shocking facts of the past few years globally has been the erasure of decades of progress against hunger globally, right? These numbers are back on the rise. And of course, thinking about higher order food and nutrition security issues, Mexico is really at the forefront of this research in thinking about protein sufficiency, micronutrient deficiency, when you have both people and communities with undernutrition as well as overnutrition and diseases of overconsumption. So really, as a lens into the world as a whole, and as a place of really tremendous policy experimentation that really could be a guide for the world on food security and climate, Mexico is really a wonderful place to think about this. And maybe to put this a little more in focus, I'm going to talk, of course, about the ENIGH, but why do we want to think about the ENIGH, if we're thinking about food security, I just want to draw out some numbers for this group, right? Mexico, of course, is an important, tremendous producer domestically, but also globally. And really in a nation of 127 million people, it's really 4.5 million farms, and really under that, it's 3.5 million farms producing the main crops that people eat. And so really this is a country very far along in this structural transformation. But if we look on the right, there are also a lot of smallholder farmers, right? So there's an incredible diversity in what production looks like, especially when we think about something like maize, where you really have big producers and a tremendous amount of smallholders as well. So really navigating these challenges, of course, is, like I said, a global concern, but Mexico could really be, I think, the place where we look to solutions. All right. I want to start by now connecting this to the ENIGH. And I want to start by saying, Octavio presented the work as in a very we did this, here's what we got, here's what everyone needs to know. And I think really the rest of us should take a moment to reflect on the tremendous effort that this data collection represents, right? So the INEGI team, as Francisco mentioned, has an incredible reputation, right, for being trusted as a team, for being able to elicit this important information. And I took the liberty of pulling this figure from the training manual, pulling some information from the training manual, just so folks here who may not know can see a little bit about how well these enumerators are trained to collect these critical data, right, for determining the poverty line. I'll talk a little bit more about other uses, but really detailed, important data, right? So there's training, for example, to help surveyors, help respondents feel more comfortable, right? How would you feel if you were drawn to be the respondent in one of these surveys, right? A week of really detailed and very difficult questions. We'll come to this in a moment, but they're not straightforward to answer. They sometimes come with a lot of kind of emotional weight to them as well. And so it's just really a tremendous effort, not only to go, collect data, but to really cultivate confidence in the respondents to be able to share that information with trust and with fidelity. So I just want to say thank you to Octavio and the team, because it's really, when you think about what these questionnaires look like, and I'll show you some more, it's really quite an undertaking. So I want to talk, as I said, a little bit about food security. And of course, when we talk about food security, right, we're talking about having access to food of sufficient quantity and nutritional value in a steady state over time. And when we talk about food security, of course, we're also talking about food insecurity, right? And that can be perhaps the most sensitive set of questions to answer, right? So let me just show you a little bit about what these questionnaires look like. So when we talk about food insecurity in the ENIGH, there's really sort of two frameworks. The first is a set of more qualitative questions about, for example, in the past 3 months, either because you didn't have money or resources, right? Did you worry that you wouldn't have enough food, right? There's about a dozen questions like this that talk about, this more qualitative dimension of food insecurity. And these self-reported metrics, as opposed to just sort of measuring, the number of tomatoes or whatever, have been shown to be really, really important for capturing the dynamics of food insecurity. So they go into, now a very important national metric of food insecurity that can be combined in a number of ways with other quantities, and has also been used in a lot of different studies, both on Mexico and also in regional comparative contexts. And this is so important because it captures really the feeling of insecurity that comes with food insecurity, right? The detriment of food insecurity is not just having enough food, but it's the psychological burden of worrying about having enough food, of feeling like you're letting your children down by not having enough food, anxiety, having conflicts about what you do with your time, et cetera. It compounds and spills over into a really broader set of issues, and these qualitative metrics are so critical for actually capturing that in a way that just pure numbers do not. So that's the first set of indicators that are here. And then, there's a sort of more quantitative consumption basket that's tallied up. And again, Octavio didn't give his team enough credit here, but this is, again, very difficult, right? If I asked you, how many potatoes did you eat last week? Or did you buy, right? Would you remember? If I asked you how many eggs did you eat this past week, would you remember, right? You would have to sit down and really think. And so it's a testament to every respondent, but also to the team that really persists and make the environment where respondents can feel like they can take the time and figure out and answer these questions. At any rate, we get really rich, detailed data about household consumption. And we say household consumption all the time, but literally, what is consumed? And this is the most fundamental piece of welfare, right? It's, as Francisco said, we talk about a consumption basket. Most of the consumption basket is food items, right? Do you have enough for your family? And this is all through very detailed lists that are collected at the household level. So this will now also be my plug. If you're ever selected in the sample, you should participate and be very grateful and give all your time and effort to presenting your data with fidelity. Okay. All right. And just a little bit more, this is again from the training manual, but again, these notebooks get left. Again, it's a week's worth of data collection, very detailed rubric to capture all the information about what's consumed in the household. So again, really amazing set of information. And again, if you're interested in the dynamics of food security, there's one of the most popular subjects among our own students at undergraduate and graduate levels right now is really thinking about what does the diet of the future look like from both a health perspective and an environmental sustainability perspective, and trying to understand, what makes behavior change in human diets and things like this. So these are the data that get used for those questions. This was, Octavio showed this earlier, but I just want to also say that, again, thinking about understanding the welfare of households really fundamentally rests on this question of how much of household expenditures go to food. That is the sort of first order basic metric that we use to think about household vulnerability to price shocks, to other sorts of welfare shocks, right? If you spend 90% of your expenditure on food and the price of food goes up, your consumption will go down, right? And so thinking about targeting households based on this metric, how much is spent on food, that is a really common piece of a targeting framework for policy initiatives in Mexico and elsewhere, right? So this is really important. And as that number of farmers goes down over time, this becomes even more important, right? Because not very many people are producers, but everyone is a consumer. So these data become ever more important for assessing welfare and the ability to withstand shocks that are either local or of more global scale. Again, I just pulled some of Octavio's results to show to you. So here, I just also wanted to show that, again, as a metric of vulnerability, and really a first-order metric of vulnerability, the ENIGH provides really interesting and representative information, right, at the subnational level. So you could compare Ciudad de Mexico and Chiapas, for example, and see over time that ratio, the amount of the expenditure that goes to food, has gone down a little bit in Ciudad de Mexico, right? And it's gone up in Chiapas, and we never want to see that number going up, right? That's something that always makes us worry from a policy perspective. And these are now, these come directly from these very detailed rosters that everybody fills out and gets aggregated with appropriate weights. So again, like, we have this important metric due to the rigor of the team. I thought I'd close with just a few studies of different types that use these data. And I'll start here with some that seem maybe a little bit more obvious, like why they would use food security metrics from the ENIGH. And I'll move a little further afield and hopefully pique your interest for how widely applicable these information are and why we're so excited, why I'm so excited for my research group and all my colleagues here at UCSD to be able to work with folks through the Microdata Lab. So over here on the left, you have studies that are, like this one that says, that is the determinants of household food insecurity in Mexico, right? This is kind of straightforward what goes along with food insecurity in different dimensions. So this could be qualitative and also some quantitative metrics putting together those consumption baskets. And that helps to think about the types of questions that Francisco raised about really multidimensional vulnerability. So if we know that really there's, for example, a shift towards food insecurity in urban communities versus rural communities, the policy response is different, right? And so really thinking about what the structure, spatially, temporally, and in terms of other metrics like indigeneity, education level, et cetera, in Mexico look like are important for immediate policy targeting and also long-run planning to understand these trends over time. And these are types of studies that you see all over the world, but really rest on quality data. I will say over here on the bottom, a more recent study looking at a similar structure of a study, looking at the determinants of food insecurity among university students' households in Mexico. This is something I was not delighted to read because I don't like to read about students suffering from food insecurity, but it's a reality right now, and it's one that's been particularly brutal in the past few years here in San Diego. And we've been, trying to do our own little surveys on campus, for example, to understand how our students are doing. And so to see that these data are really being leveraged to answer that question for Mexican students really, I thought, was exemplary. This is a group that is often really underappreciated in terms of food insecurity, but there's often big sacrifices that go towards higher education, and students are often in a really precarious economic condition. And so this type of research, I think, is really important. And then over on the right, the ENIGH data were part of a big comparative study of countries with high quality food insecurity data to look at what happened during the pandemic to food security. And it's kind of a multi-dimensional problem, right? Difference between producers, consumers, those whose income was hard hit, those whose wasn't, right? There are real sectoral differences in structure of how the pandemic hit, and these data provided in this study a clearer view of what that looked like. Francisco mentioned this earlier as well, but these data also form the basis for analysis of impacts of domestic policies, right? So thinking about conditional cash transfer programs and their impact on food security, or this earlier version of ENIGH, but really were the baseline for this national evaluation. And then over on the right, thinking about what, the world food economy is connected, but it's got a funny structure. It's not economically rational or optimal because food is not just just a commodity, and there's strong preferences and preferences around self-sufficiency that do not conform to standard economic structures. And so thinking about how a domestic food security situation responds to global changes is really important for a country like Mexico, right, who's a major global player in the world food economy, and whose performance, as an agricultural producer, obviously impacts domestic welfare, but really is important for welfare elsewhere in the world. So thinking about, what happens to the whole structure of food security and poverty when the global price environment changes in an interconnected agricultural country is really important. All right, and then this is where I hope to pique your interest a little bit about how widely applicable these data are. Like I said, I'm working in a number of ways to think about how climate change and food security intersect. Right now, most of the attention on mitigating human emissions focuses on energy and transportation and industry, and that's correct. Those are the biggest collective contributors. But if you imagine a world where we've decarbonized all of those industries, right? We have renewables, we've got clean transportation, we've made progress. Let's imagine that world. There's still about a third of emissions left that come from food and agriculture and associated land use change. So we have to figure out how to address that problem, and it's really hard, right? If we think about food security, right, the safety valve in our planetary system is that we could always, in theory, expand cropland to grow more food, but that's actually potentially devastating to our climate. And so we really need to think about how do we stop land conversion, preserve forests, and also boost agricultural productivity. That's a really tough question. Mexico's at the center of it, doing all sorts of really interesting stuff. But also, you know, we need to make sure that our visions domestically all hang together internationally. There's been a set of exercises that this study refers to here, the FABLE project, that's in part centered here at UC San Diego. I think Professor McCord spoke in this series earlier, so he's on this study and helped lead this effort. And the idea here is to have you know, policymakers in different countries come together and sketch out what they view their land use and food security futures to look like. And this means they need to model food demand, and they need to model economic growth, and they need to make some assumptions about policy preferences, and they come up with sort of a land use scenario for the future. And that rests fundamentally on those food consumption baskets that Octavio showed you. As income goes up, how do people's preferences change? How much meat do they consume? How many eggs do they consume? Et cetera, et cetera. All of that goes into the calculation of what is the land footprint going to look like. And what's really interesting here then is that countries often assume in the first round of this modeling exercise that they'll import a lot of food, right? Okay, we'll conserve, we'll be good conservationists, and you know what? We're going to move people out of agriculture and we're going to import food. Yeah, from where? If everybody's doing that, right? So, and a really interesting aspect of this project has then been linking these models together. Now you get policymakers from all these countries to sit down and say, oops, we all assumed we were going to import from each other. Let's iterate and make sure this world actually closes and looks like a realistic world exercise. So a really fundamentally important global climate policy problem that rests on the food security data of these household surveys to model that demand and to really make sure we understand what's a likely future. And then finally over here on the side, thinking again about the future, really what happens to smallholder producers in a future world, right? We often assume a sort of steady consolidation of agriculture, and that's not really true in most cases. There's this tail of small producers who have immense importance for their own community food security. Maybe they are producing heritage varietals of crops that are of cultural importance. Maybe there are regional preferences around varietals or around regional specialty products. We see that, for example, like think about sort of the cheese production landscape. Everybody's got their own local varietal and it tastes different and it's better. And honey, there's all sorts of little really important production, and it actually plays an important role in local food security in those communities too. And so to think about what happens to smallholder producers in the future, how does food security correlate with being a producer if you're sort of moving into this world where there are not that many small producers left? Another way of envisioning the future, and this study also drew heavily on ENIGH data. So I'll leave off there, but I just want to end again with a note of gratitude for the ENIGH team and this incredible data collection effort. We're really excited to hopefully put it to wonderful use across a bunch of domains in the future. Thanks.
Go to the table over there for the Q&A. ¿Alguna persona someone wants to ask a question or comment? Voy. Paz.
Thank you very much for your comment. It was really interesting. I was shocked because of the data of the income of the houses, how the thing has increased a lot. As has been the social program benefits, or the transfer for social programs, and not, for example, grants, or not, for example, income coming for work. I think that is a terrible new, especially in an electoral year. But my question was about the effect of the increase of the minimum salary or the minimum wage in Mexico, because it has been increased a lot since 2015, but most of them since the 2 last years, no? How can we consider this increase of the minimum salary or the minimum wage has been into the houses, considering especially that income from work hasn't increased? So, how do you affect to your measure this increase of the minimum salary, and anything to say about that? I think it's really very very sad. Thank you.
Dios. Voy a contestar en español. ¿Me permiten? Claro. ¿Sí? ¿Sí? Ok. Porque de por sí la pregunta es complicada, que la diga yo en inglés, pues todavía va a estar más complicado. A ver, los resultados del ENIGH 2022 nos trajeron comportamientos que llamaron la atención muchísimo, ¿no? Para los que ya la están trabajando podrán verlo. Hubo un incremento en ingreso por trabajo, que fue parte de las láminas que presenté hace un momento. Y, por ejemplo, el ingreso que hubo o el incremento que hubo en los ingresos por transferencia es similar a años anteriores. Es decir, sí hay un incremento, pero no es un incremento que te mueva la distribución de los ingresos de manera abrupta. ¿A qué voy? Que sí, lo que creció fue el ingreso por trabajo. Yo como INEGI no nos atrevemos a decir que la causa fueron los salarios mínimos, pero desde luego algo se deja ver ahí. El ingreso en los salarios mínimos fue del 200% al interior del país, ¿sí? Y del 300% en los estados de la frontera norte. Entonces, vemos que en la parte baja de la distribución se da un crecimiento todavía mayor prácticamente en el ingreso subordinado, aun cuando sea una modalidad formal o informal. O sea, pareciera también que hay como un espectro, un efecto ya faro que pudiera estar permeando a lo largo de toda la sociedad. Hay mucho todavía que estudiar. O sea, como instituto nosotros no nos dedicamos a hacer la evaluación de la política pública, pero por ejemplo sí le vamos dando seguimiento a muchas investigaciones, a muchos especialistas que a estas alturas, bueno, pues sí entre sus narrativas vienen diciendo que desde luego un efecto pudo haber sido el ingreso o el incremento de los salarios mínimos, desde luego las inversiones que ha habido en el sur del país, ¿sí? Entonces hay varias cosas que recientemente, antes de venir para acá, creo que salió un paper de Gerardo, del doctor Gerardo Esquivel, donde decía que posiblemente sí, los incrementos en los salarios mínimos, toda la inversión que ha habido presupuestal en el sur, y no me acuerdo qué otro punto también por ahí ya lo venían planteando como parte de estos efectos, ¿no? Entonces, podría decirlo hasta ahí.
¿Alguien más quiere participar? ¿Someone else? Questions? Va a contestar, sorry, go ahead.
No, I have a follow-up question for Octavio, if I may, unless anyone else wants to ask their question. So my question is related in the sense that my understanding is that this last 2022 ENIGH has no methodological changes, right? Which was one of the first things that people speculated might be behind this abrupt and unexpected change in income and consumption. And so my question is whether have there been any studies done in ENIGH, or as far as you know, elsewhere, that harmonize it with national accounts? You know, like there's a stable relationship between the averages that you produce via ENIGH and what comes out via national accounts. Has that exercise been implemented yet, or not?
Tenemos un ejercicio con respecto a los ingresos disponibles por cuentas nacionales, ¿sí? Y seguimos observando pues, esa enorme brecha. A ver, ¿qué es lo que ocurre? Que cuando nosotros vamos a los hogares captamos estos ingresos y si tú lo comparas contra el ingreso disponible que sacan por medio del Sistema Nacional de Cuentas Nacionales, hay una brecha. Nosotros en los hogares no logramos captar la totalidad del ingreso que se mide en cuentas nacionales. Entonces, esa brecha ha sido persistente. Cada ejercicio tiene su más menos, se cierra a veces la brecha un poco más, a veces se abre un poco más. En este caso, un ejercicio que tenemos, que no me atrevería a decir que es el definitivo, mostraba como 1% o 2 puntos porcentuales más cerrado con respecto a 2020. Pero en 2020 hay otras cosas que también se abren más y ya empiezas a ver el ingreso por trabajo o el ingreso por transferencias. Entonces, la brecha sigue persistiendo. De hecho, en estos momentos hay muchas pláticas sobre de qué ejercicios deberíamos estar haciendo para tratar de entender lo que se mide desde cuentas nacionales y lo que tenemos a través de las encuestas en hogares. Incluso en Santiago de Chile hace unos días también por ahí especialistas de varias oficinas nacionales están proponiendo métodos pues, para juntar las diferentes fuentes de información y poder hacer ejercicios más complementarios. Pero bueno, sí tenemos algunos ejercicios ya por ahí preparados y sigue manteniéndose esas brechas.
Someone else?
Thank you. I'm wondering if within INEGI you've had discussions about the possibility of also trying to measure income derived from illicit economies in Mexico that may be reflected at the household level and that otherwise you would not be able to capture it. And so I'm just wondering if within your discussions internally of trying to estimate this, if that has been something that has come up, and if you could share with us, some of the main points from those discussions. Thank you.
De estos mismos ejercicios, ¿sí? A ver si lo entiendo. O sea, entre, por ejemplo, el ingreso de cuentas nacionales y lo que da la encuesta. Ah, ok. Mira, nosotros captamos la totalidad del ingreso pues, que le llega a los hogares ilícitos. Es complicado. Nosotros explícitamente no ponemos en riesgo las entrevistas con temas sensibles. Aún así, ese 0.1% que yo refería en la quinta categoría de las fuentes por ingreso, que es el 0.1% de todo el ingreso total, ahí captamos otras entradas de dinero que a veces nos las dicen como que me lo dieron en la calle ese dinero o me llegó por otro lado, o ahí hay otros que lo registramos en esa categoría. Pero sí, la encuesta no está diseñada como para estar captando estos hechos ilícitos, por ejemplo. De por sí, al igual que en todo el mundo, las encuestas en ingresos tienen el pequeño detalle de que no vas a llegar a la casa del millonario del país a decirle, pues, ¿cuál es tu ingreso? Porque para empezar, por probabilidad, para que te salga seleccionado, pues es prácticamente cero. Existe la probabilidad, pues es diferente de cero, pero pues tiende a ser cero. Y la segunda, que en los hogares pues existe un subregistro de todo lo que nos declaran y eso es inevitable. ¿Qué podemos hacer? Hemos estado recientemente innovando en cambiar nuestros cuestionarios, que yo los traía aquí por si alguien quería contestarlo en lo que aventaba mi discurso en inglés. Estamos tratando de migrar a aplicaciones electrónicas en donde el informante pueda responder por él mismo sin necesidad de que un entrevistador pues, lo esté registrando en estos cuadernos. Ese es un cuestionario, ¿no? Entonces, por ejemplo, estamos probando en otra encuesta que medimos riqueza, en donde pues, ya damos el equipo electrónico al informante y él contesta con toda privacidad. El entrevistador no puede ver lo que registra la persona y te lanza algunas alertas. Si se te ocurre poner ahí que ingresas $80 millones al mes, te dice, oye, a ver, esto es correcto, y tiene algunas estrategias así. Y ese es el tipo de cosas que ahorita estamos tratando como de implementar para ediciones futuras, todavía no. Y no lo implementamos de golpe porque, como todos ustedes, como usuarios de la información, lo que buscamos es mantener esa comparabilidad. Entonces, en 2016 hubo una pequeña instrucción que cambiamos en el entrenamiento de la gente, y eso es lo que hizo que entre el 14 y el 16 hubiera un cambio en las tendencias de la información. Por eso la información ahora la comparamos del 2016 para acá. Entre 2020 y 2022 no ha habido un cambio de instrucciones, inclusive desde la 18-16 no ha habido un cambio de instrucciones. Entonces ahora nos estamos preparando para una 2024 en donde vamos a actualizar algunas variables y lo sometemos a consulta pública, hacemos pruebas de tal forma que ustedes en la 2024 puedan tener la certeza de la información que están obteniendo y con ello pues tener certeza en los análisis que están realizando día a día en sus investigaciones, ¿no? Pero bueno, ese es el tipo de cosas que vamos trabajando ahí en el instituto.
¿Tenemos a alguien más? ¿Someone else?
Solo para darle seguimiento. O sea, si tú pudieras escribirle tu carta a Santa Claus de cómo quieres hacer la encuesta perfecta de ingreso, ¿qué cambios harías con la encuesta que tienes ahora? Entendiendo también que está el tema de comparabilidad, pero si tú pudieras implementar el instrumento ideal, ¿cómo sería?
Para empezar, pues sí, tendría que ser por medios electrónicos. Sí tendríamos ya que tener otro tipo de tecnología. De ahí en más no tengo una fórmula que pueda garantizar ese cierre de las brechas con respecto a cuentas nacionales, porque al final de cuentas todo radica en la voluntad del informante. Algo que sí puedo decir también es que el INEGI en México tiene un alto reconocimiento. O sea, el hecho de llegar con esos instrumentos y acampar literalmente 7 días en un hogar, créanme que rompe el hielo completamente. Ya al final creo que hay una muy buena interacción entre un entrevistador de INEGI y bueno, pues los hogares que vamos visitando. Entonces, yo creo que empezaría y lo más fácil decirte sería cambiar a la parte digital, ¿no? Para empezar. Pero desde luego hay otro tipo de estrategias que pudieran utilizarse a lo mejor para tener mejor captación de ingresos, pero hay que probarlo todo eso. Hay unas formas en donde le decimos, a ver, por $3,000 al mes, ¿tú te cambiarías de trabajo? Y ya dependiendo de lo que me contestes, te hago alguna otra pregunta. Oye, no, pues a ver, si en tu actual trabajo te dieran $1,000 más, ¿sí cambiarías? De tal forma que cuando ya llego y te pregunto tu ingreso por trabajo, yo ya te encajoné, de tal forma que ya no me puedes ocultar ese tipo de información. También estamos por ahí a la espera de implementar ese tipo de baterías. Desde luego, todo eso pensando en que pudiera ser más preciso el tema, ¿no?
Someone else? Are we good? Any closing remarks, gentlemen? No? Thank you very much. Vamos a darles un aplauso. Okay.